Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Dr. Carmichael.
Yeah, but someone's in the very back. Oh, okay. Can you all hear me okay? Before I start though, I thank you for mentioning the conference, and you get 15% off. Everyone gets 15% off except for the guy with the Michigan cap right there in the fifth row. He doesn't get it.
First ticket is for the money. We'll draw one ticket down. Read it out.
The whole number or just the last three digits? The whole number? 605-960. 605-960.
$203.
I think she has it over there to your left. 605-960. We're good?
And then draw one more for the ball.
You know what? They can get one of my books for free. Well, I'll give them one. If you want to do a third one, take that. All right. 606-089. 606-089. All the way in the far back. I would. Not sure what you want except the applause of the audience. Good. He's all the way in the back. You're winning this.
They'll just,
All right. You good? Hey, thank you all for the invitation. It's been a few years. I've learned that this building is gone through a major facelift. And I have to say, yeah, it looks lovely. But from a speaker's perspective, it's a little disturbing to see that there's soft, cushy chairs now that you're sitting in and not the hard benches, right? So I'll be keeping an eye on you all. You may do it again? I really don't want to use the microphone. Who can't hear me? In the back? You can't hear me at all? Can they change it up there? What's that? Okay, so can you now hear me in the back? Hey, in the back, raise your hands if you can hear me okay. This would be really hard to do because I've got two other things to juggle. How are we doing here? Are we better? Yes? All right. So again, thank you so much for the invitation to come here. To come back here reminds me, well, one, I've got two Tar Heels at home, even though I'm at Gettysburg College. My twin daughters, were born in Greensboro, North Carolina. So I got Tar Heel daughters and also a very strong connection to the founder of the Round Table, or one of the founders, Max Williams. And many of you, of course, remember Max fondly. He was a mentor of mine. I took replaced Max at Western Carolina many, many years ago. What a wonderful man. His wife, Sarah, are so incredibly good to me. Max and I in Cullowhee, we started a Civil War Roundtable that's still going strong. Begin to see that he did the same thing here. You know, we live in a time where the press on both sides likes to take the exception, what's unusual, and they hold it out as being mainstream. It gives us very distorted pictures, I think, of reality. And here I'll make a defense of the academy. There's plenty wrong with it, like any institution. But you all want to remember Max Williams. Max Williams spent his entire career in the academy. Max Williams cared deeply about his students. Max Williams cared deeply about the public and making history accessible. So when we get these screeches, which we're subjected to far too much, just remember Max Williams. And remember Max Williams' legacy is this place. And it's a wonderful legacy. And again, it's such a pleasure to be here. Now I have to do the PowerPoint here. And as you can only imagine, an academic with anything technical or practical can always be a challenge. So again, I hope you have patience with me. How about you all in the back? How are you hearing me? Are you okay? No problems. We're all good. All right. All right. So brace yourself. Our first photo. And there it is. It's behind me. That's a young Pete Carmichael, a very young Pete Carmichael. During the summers, when I was a college student back in Indiana, I would go to the national park. I started at Appomattox, but I spent most of my career at Fredericksburg. And look at that hair. As you can see, I didn't comb my hair then, and I don't really comb my hair now. You're going to put a bird in there. Those uniforms, by the way, are so uncomfortable. They're polyester pants. And that straw hat, right? That's hot. It's terrible. But I love the job. And one of the walking tours I gave was along the sunken road that was occupied by Confederate soldiers who repulsed repeated Union attacks on the afternoon of December 13th, attacks that netted, somewhere between probably 6,000 to 7,000 casualties in a single afternoon. Many of you have been to Fredericksburg. Many of you know that ground that Union soldiers charged across, all of it has been developed. And so when you're giving a walking tour there, you've got to really, really use all your descriptive powers to get people to feel the power of place. And I ended my talk there in an unfortunate way. And there's not really a day that goes by that I don't regret it. And I ended my talk by emphasizing to people that the Union soldiers who made that charge, who gave their lives, that they did so, one, out of devotion and commitment to their comrades. I stand by that. There's no doubt that increased discipline amongst those units. Shoulder to shoulder, feeling the touch of the man next to you, that empowered men to face what all of us probably consider to be a charge that was suicidal. Agreed? But how these men made sense of it, and this is the part I regret so deeply, how I explained it to visitors that Union soldiers were disillusioned after the battle, and many of them were. And I then stressed, and that's the key part here, I stressed the Union soldiers felt that the government had sacrificed them, that they had been abandoned and betrayed, not just by the government, by the Northern people as well. I played into the political sympathies of my audience. This is an audience, again, we're talking 15 years ago, that has Vietnam still fresh in their minds. This is an audience, those Americans who largely believe that the soldiers in Vietnam, that they were abandoned by their government, abandoned by the people. Now listen, there are parallels to be true. There's no doubt about that. And we certainly can talk about those parallels. But what I overlooked the power of ideas and motivation, the power of ideas, convictions. Those Northern soldiers who made that charge on December the 13th, they certainly questioned their officers, and yet they knew and understood that there was a higher idea that was worth sacrificing for. That higher idea is the idea of union in 1862, and the war now had veered toward emancipation. And so for Northern soldiers, many of whom were deeply, I would say most deeply racist, they still understood that the war for union was now tied to the war for Black freedom. I didn't mention any of that, none of it. Now, this is all before the scholarship of an important historian that you've heard of, James McPherson. Let's spare you this picture here. I'm going to go to a blank screen. There we go. Much better. James McPherson wrote a book, a very important book, called For Cause and Comrade. And in this book, he discovered that Union and Confederate soldiers, they were highly ideological, deeply political, and they understood the stakes of the war. The importance of ideology cannot be stressed enough. But then I was assigned a task by the editors of the Littlefield series that resulted in this book. That blog does not exist anymore. at the bottom, I gave up on that pretty quickly, but the book still is there. I was asked to write this book by the editors of the series, Gary Gallagher and Michael Parrish, and it was a real challenge because so many other historians, McPherson and others, they had written about soldiers with such persuasiveness as to why men fought. This question of motivation, I thought, man, it's been done and done over 1 million times. What can I possibly do? Well, I started to get uncomfortable with James McPherson's emphasis on ideology as a motivating factor. Now, let's be clear here. James McPherson has a Pulitzer Prize. How many Pulitzers does Pete Carmichael have? 0. How many will Pete Carmichael get? 0. I interviewed Dr. McPherson for our summer conference. And before the conference, I said to my wife, Beth, I said, sweetheart, I'm interviewing a Pulitzer Prize winning historian. I got to get me an Armani suit. And you know what she said? She said, when you get your Pulitzer, we'll get you an Armani suit. So I'm wearing this, right? What really started to get me to think differently about McPherson's work is this book, still in print. It's a book that I just happened to pick up at the Gettysburg Visitor Center. It's the letters of Charles Biddlecombe, edited by Katie Aldridge. Katie Aldridge is not a professional historian. She's an ultra marathoner. These are like marathons that are like 30, 40 miles plus. She bought a house with her husband in upstate New York. They were going through the attic, tossing stuff aside. They came across an old whiskey box. And in that whiskey box were the letters of Charles Biddlecombe. She edited them, and they are absolutely fascinating. Again, still in print, get it on Amazon. I assigned this to my introductory Civil War class. We spend at least once a week going through the letters together. And I'm telling you all this. I know you get frustrated when you think young people don't care about the past. It is not true. Don't buy that line. Don't buy it. I told my kids, I said, man, I wish I had a webcam in my room so that you all could see how they invest themselves in the study of the past. I'll give you one other thing, a bit of good news. Every summer, Gettysburg College places between 25 to 35 students at national parks, Civil War related, every summer. We're able to do it because of the Brian Pohanka Foundation. Brian Pohanka was a historian of note. You might remember him, died tragically of cancer. The Pohanka Foundation, we're now up to $1 million in the endowment. That allows us to work with our partners in the Park Service and all these kids that you would love to see here. Now, it is spring break. We know where they are right now. Not on a Civil War battlefield, that's for sure, right? These kids, they are out there on the front lines. They're giving tours at Vicksburg, Andersonville, Chickamauga. Of course, Gettysburg, Antietam. There's a lot of interest out there, and I see it with my kids every day when they're working with the Biddlecombe letters. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Biddlecombe. Charles Biddlecombe's from Monroe, New York. He had about 54 acres. He was married. He had 2 kids. Had hired a young Irish woman to work around the house as well. In 1861, he enlisted. He got ill. He was able to get a medical discharge. But then in 1864, the draft hit. And for whatever reason, he wasn't covered anymore by that medical discharge. He did not obviously get a substitute. Instead, he joined, got a bounty. You know what? He joined because he was conscripted. That's why he did it. Good? So, before he goes into the Army, he wrote his wife a letter. And in this letter, he said that his family, he's not referring to her, to his family, his parents, his siblings, they considered him to be the black sheep of the family. The theme that's going to come out today is that for us to understand these men, you have to understand their private lives. And when you understand their private lives, you'll also recognize the importance of those relationships they had with their wives and their families. When we go to battlefields, we often look at them as chessboards. That's a mistake. That is a mistake. Now, I'm not suggesting to you that in the heat of battle, that a soldier is thinking about home and family. But I am telling you that the men made sense of the horrible carnage that they saw, that they witnessed. They made sense of it because of these private and personal relationships that are there for us to explore through the letters. This is not just about ideology. It's about something that's more private, more personal, and more emotional. Ideology is just one dimension. And now the next question for you all to think about before I dive into Biddlecom. James McPherson's asking about why soldiers fought, and that's an important question. But here's the question I want us to puzzle through. How did soldiers cope? How did soldiers cope? It's related, but a different question. So Biddlecom, fall of 1863, he boarded a train. He got off on Elmira, New York. When he got off the train, he was handed a raggedy old blanket. He was ordered to sleep on a floor with some just putrid rations. The very next morning, he wrote his wife. And when he wrote his wife, he said that he had, in the making, a medical discharge. That medical discharge was because, ready? That he had a bad cold and rheumatism. As you can imagine, that wasn't going to play. No doctor was going to release him from the Army. He got back on the train, went all the way down to Culpeper, Virginia, got off the train and was assigned to the 147th New York, a regiment that saw some pretty hard fighting on July 1st at Gettysburg. He's now surrounded by veterans. His mood did not improve whatsoever. In fact, he found all of his officers to be insufferable. He even criticized George Gordon Meade. He could not believe all the marches that the men had to take, which he believed were pointless. He said that these marches were destroying his body. After one march, he wrote his wife, he said that he passed out, and when he passed out, he had expelled over 30 passages of the bowels. It passed so much blood and mucus and became so weak that I could hardly stand alone. Still again, he could get no discharge. His dissatisfaction building. December of 1863, he wrote to his wife, and again, bear with me, I'm going to do my best with these slides. He wrote, Cursed be the day that I saw my name drawn as a conscript, and damned be the hour that I made up my mind to come as a draftee. I think sometimes that if it was not for you and my children, I would blow out my brains. Damn the South, damn the war, and all that had anything to do in getting it up. Biddlecom once said, it's the title of the book, he said, I am no freedom shrieker, which meant what? No abolitionist, right? And he also said, and no union savior. No freedom shrieker, no union savior. Remember that. Here's a man who's basically saying what? I don't got skin in this game. I don't believe in this war. Both sides are crazy, and he doesn't care for the South as well. And so now we get to the spring of 1864. Spring of 1864, he was tempted to desert by some comrades who called themselves the Blue Ridge Brigade. The Blue Ridge Brigade. Why? Because they looked at the Blue Ridge Mountains and they thought, there's their passage to desert, to escape, get out of the Army. He was this close to deserting, this close. But remember what he wrote his wife. Black sheep of the family. Nobody's respecting him. He's a man who's got a reputation that he wants to be able to preserve. And so he stayed with the Army. As we know, what ensued in May of 1864 is the Overland Campaign. The letters are fascinating. His first letter is in the middle of the campaign. It's just a little note, and it is a declaration of survival. Like so many men, bewildered by why he's on the right side of the side. He can't believe it. He gets through the Overland Campaign, and at the beginning of June, he writes the following. There's too many quotes around me. Here, right here it is. Men are beginning to get sick now that the excitement of battle has cooled off a little. That's really common. I hope we all talk about this. We're going to have some time for question and answer period. All right. We got to talk about trauma, how these men cope. That's a big, important question. They are thinking over the narrow escapes they have had and counting up those friends that have been killed or wounded. Sad are the faces and full of grief. Dreary foreboding fills our hearts as we think of what has been done and what is yet left to be undone. This is then followed by another letter. I hate this life worse than a cat does hot soup. If I ever get out, I will stuff my old uniform with straw and stand it up in one corner of his house in New York, in one corner to look at when I feel out of humor, just to remind me that home with its little cares and troubles is not the worst place in the world for a man to enjoy life. As you can see, he's a real optimist here, right? So he's about had it, right? He's about had it. He's got this uniform. And here's another thing, my friends, is to think about the things of war. The things of war embodied meaning and embodied feeling, because these soldiers, and any of you have been in the military and you've seen combat, you all know language fails you. Words fail you. That's all you got, but it's still not enough to be able to convey to those people who haven't felt it, who haven't experienced it, to be able to really know what that experience is. But he's like, wait a minute, this coat, right? Everything I hate about military service. All right, it's about a month later, and he gets a new coat. And this is now his response to that. I should like to save it. He's referring now to his old coat, right? His old coat. I should like to save it as a souvenir of the hard-fought battles of the Wilderness, Laurel Hill, Spotsylvania, North Anna, and Petersburg. I should like to keep it with all of its dust, samples of different soil, from Culpeper to this place. 'Tis not much of a coat now, the skirt's torn and ragged, and it is sadly ripped under the arms. Still, as I look at it as it hangs on the butt of my musket, I think more of it than I ever did of any article of dress I ever owned in my life before. Man, this guy wanted to take that coat, right, stuff it, and use it as a punching bag for life's frustrations, and then a few weeks later, it's now become a holy relic. It says to me, my friends, that soldiers had a conflicted attitude about many aspects of military service, but especially about combat. I saw it time and time again. Men horrified by what they had seen and what they had done, dreading going back to the battlefield, and yet in the very same letter, in awe of the spectacle of thousands of men lined up together with rifles, muskets, sun glinting off their bayonets, right? They're conflicted about war. And so what did Biddlecombe say to me? This. Biddlecombe, like most Civil War soldiers, had multiple personalities. When we think about Civil War soldiers, we too often think about them in binaries. Was a man brave or a coward? Was he dutiful or did he desert? Was he idealistic or did he not have any political convictions? Do you see what those binaries? Biddlecombe was what? He was all of those things, all of them at different times of the war. So we must ask ourselves, why is it that we've not been able to see these multiple personalities? One reason is because the soldiers often wrote letters in ways that the people back home would see them in a favorable light. Biddlecombe's somewhat of an exception, right? He pulls back the curtains. He wants people to see, in essence, the real deal. So that's one reason why. And that desire to, one might say, hide or romanticize war certainly was the case after 1865 when the veterans came back together. And I will read you one quote here. It's from a Confederate soldier at a reunion in the early 1900s. This Confederate soldier had survived the crater. As you know, the crater is that mine that Pennsylvania soldiers dug. They blew up a Confederate fort. This survivor of the crater, in front of fellow veterans, said the following. When we was blowed up at the crater, me and my men was throwed up in the air. And as we went up, we met our captain coming down. And as he went by, he hollered, "Rally, boys," when you hit the ground. So these romantic tales that the veterans told, man, they appeal to us because I'll tell you what people want from their Civil War. 9 times out of 10, they want bedtime stories. That's why when you go to Gettysburg until very recently, at Spangler Spring, what do people love to read about? How Union and Confederate soldiers who had been shooting at each other, trying to kill each other, then on the night of July 2nd, they did what? They drank from the same canteen. Did that happen? No, of course it didn't, right? But that's what we like. That's what we want to hear. And so that's one reason why we're not getting the multiple personalities. The other problem is what historians do. What historians do is they give you an idea, and then they take a few well-chosen selected quotes, right, to support that idea. And then another paragraph, and you'll hear my voice, and then a few more quotes to illustrate that. That's called cherry picking. That's called taking these quotes out of their context. What I decided to do in my book was to tell extended narratives on individual soldiers, their microbiographies, because that's what's essential. You got to see the man's words. You got to read about his actions. You got to do it over an extended period of time, and you always have to do it within the context of the war itself. What I discovered from that is that this coping strategy that soldiers relied upon or created is called pragmatism. Pragmatism. Soldiers on both sides are shocked by the fact that individual bravery, heroism, that it did not win the day. They were surprised that circumstances and personal forces that often dictated, controlled the outcome of events. If you subscribe or adhere to a rigid code of duty, if you just followed a set of beliefs and refused to budge from it, what did soldiers discover pretty quickly on? You get yourself killed, right? These men did want to survive. So pragmatism in thought, pragmatism in action. I'm going to give you 2 examples so that we're still doing fine on time. I'm going to give you 2 examples that illustrate pragmatism in action. One of the things to recognize about Civil War Americans is that they entered the war believing that there was a just God, and that just God shaped the outcome of human affairs or events for the benefit of his chosen people. They believed that God brought, to some degree, coherence to life, purpose to life, meaning to life. It didn't take long for Civil War soldiers on both sides to see the mayhem of combat, of battle. It shattered that illusion. There was purpose, clarity, order from above. Did these men turn into atheists? No, absolutely not. Not even close. But they were confused. They were confused about how to read the world. And way to illustrate this is the example of Alexander Keever. Alexander Keever was a North Carolinian. Alexander Keever came to Lee's army in late 1864. Alexander Keever saw this when he was in the trenches of Petersburg. This is actually an illustration from Harper's Weekly from the summer of '64. So Keever actually came after this. And what Keever saw from the trenches of Petersburg was what we would call a no man's land. He would watch Confederate soldiers racing toward the Union picket line without their muskets, right? What were they trying to do? Get themselves captured, right? So they'd be sent to a prison camp. He saw that day in and day out, and he really was beside himself. He did not know how to interpret this. Was this a sign from God that he too should desert? And he was worried because things at home were dire. And again, I can't stress enough this notion that women have always been bystanders at a time of war is one of the greatest myths of history. They are not bystanders. They are active in their own ways and in a deeply political way. Keever's wife sent him letter after letter, begging, pleading for him to come home. He was so distressed by her letters, he said, if I survive this, I'm afraid I'm going to come home and you'll just be skin and bones because you've been worrying so much. He time and time again tried to write her cheerful letters. She would have absolutely none of it. But he saw something that she could not fully appreciate. And what he had seen was a Confederate deserter in the previous fall, get executed, get shot. saw it. And he knew and explained to her what in God's name would he do if he deserted? Where could he go? But he was certainly confused. So he lays out the situation to his wife. It is too far to walk for and dangerous. Also, if I go home, I could not stay there unless I would hide out, and that would be worse than to stay here. And if the officers would find me, they would send me back here and I would be shot to death, and that would be worse than to stay now. There he has. He has absolutely put it out. Here's all the pragmatic considerations. But he doesn't understand how to read this moment. Is this desertion that he watched every single day, is that a sign from God that he too should leave? Or has God just stepped back? Is he punishing Southerners for their sins? What to do? He did not know, but he understood the great risk. So here's where he becomes a pragmatist, and I call a providential pragmatist. Dear wife, and this is now, I'm sorry, spring of 1865. Dear wife, I do hope and trust in the Lord that this cruel war will soon end, so us poor soldiers will get to come home to see our beloved families. But I do not know how to wait any longer. But I will have to wait till it pleases the Lord for me to be loosed from this cruel yoke of bondage. God, that language is a Southerner referencing slavery. I mean, that's what he's referencing here. Comparing himself to a slave. If it is his will, then I will get to come home and see you all one more time. And if it is his will for me to die here, then it is right for me. A certain resignation, right? I guess you may even call it fatalism. All right, so what do you think? How many of you think Kiever waited out the rest of the war? Look, it's March of 65. The handwriting's on the wall. How many of you think Kiever waited it out from this letter and what you've seen? Right? All right, my friends, and this is my very point. That's why we have to look over an extended period, because if we just had this letter, we would say, boy, it is in fact his faith in God, his belief in providence that anchored him into the trenches. Well, what happened was, less than 2 weeks after this, it got to be too much, and he decided to take his chances with 3 other men, and they ran across that no man's land, and he gave himself up to Union pickets. He was then escorted up to a prison camp and then finally released, and obviously got to come home after the war. My point again is for us to appreciate the evolution, the changes of how men thought during the course of the war. And what I want you to think about is Kiever a dutiful soldier? Because when we think about Civil War soldiers, we always refer to them as dutiful men, right? Cut from a different cloth. Kiever has a sense of duty. I don't want you all to forget that. We could talk about it. He has a sense of duty. There's no doubt about it. He has more than one sense of duty, and there's certainly tensions among them. The last person I'm going to talk to you about real quickly is John Foster. John Foster's letters have been published. John Foster, everyone will perk up here when I say this. I have never read a set of letters that are more sexually explicit than John Foster's. He was very, very open with his wife. He gave her lots of instructions about lots of things. It's truly shocking. John Foster was wounded at Gettysburg at the Wilderness. Before the battle, he told his wife that he was deserting. His promotion to lieutenant hadn't arrived yet. He was angry about that. He was angry with his captain. He said he couldn't keep up. He said, I'm getting out of this thing. At the Wilderness, he did escape from the ranks, got on a train with some other men pretending to be officers. They got up into Washington, D.C. He then hid out in a boarding house, hid out. And while he was in that boarding house, it's again during the middle of the Overland campaign, that's May of 1864. During that, he's reading the newspapers and he, of course, seeing that his regiment's getting chewed up, right? Suffering horrible losses, but he's getting more and more antsy, more and more antsy. And he, though, confides to his wife that he did not believe he could take it anymore at the front, couldn't do it. And he wrote this to her. Sorry. Not that either. I'm going to play lieutenant for a while. In fact, as long as I can, and I don't care what the consequences are. They can't more than shoot me. Actually, they can do that. They can shoot you. They can kill you, right? They can't call me a skedaddler. I think that's super important here, no? This is a man who had fought at Gettysburg, who was a veteran, who had been wounded. They can't call me a skedaddler. I do not know what I will do yet, or rather, what I will be made to do. What I will be made to do. The pressure got to be too much. Foster finally left that boarding house. He made it to this place called Camp Distribution. It's in Northern Virginia. And then he was sent back to his regiment. This was after the fighting had ended after North Anna. And when he walked into camp, he wrote to his wife later that his captain saw him, turned, and walked the other way. Foster wrote to his wife, he was mystified as to why the captain was so angry. I don't know. You abandoned your regiment during the heart of a campaign. I suspect that had something to do with it. But the point is this. John Foster saw himself as a dutiful Union soldier. John Foster, before Gettysburg, wanted to come home, and he wanted his regiment to go after dissenters against the Union war. John Foster got wounded at Gettysburg. John Foster believed he had done what? He had done his duty. He had done his duty. And so I will give you this sense of being a courageous soldier had changed radically. 1861, you were either courageous or you were a coward. You see now with Foster, it's what? There's a lot more gray to it. I'll give you an example of how those notions of courage change. This is from a Georgia officer. This happened in Fredericksburg in 1862. He said that there was a soldier who was trying to receive a gunshot wound so he could go home with furlough. He got that one wound, and he was joyous, this is the quote, joyously displaying his arm, exclaiming, "Here's my 30 days furlough." And just at that moment, another mini ball entered his leg, which caused him to drop to the ground, and he cried out, "Furlough extended to 60 days. But that'll do, I don't want any more." I want you to see again how this man and how John Foster and how even Kiever rejiggered their sense of duty. And what brings that into focus here is a person that I talked about the last time was John Futch. And I'm going to compare him to Oliver Wendell Holmes. John Futch, North Carolinian from Hanover County before the war. Now it's New Hanover County. I hope I'm getting that part right. John Futch, his brother Charlie died in his arms on July 3rd after getting wounded the previous evening on July the 2nd. John Futch was illiterate. John Futch spoke his letters to comrades who were barely literate themselves. And John Futch spoke this. Charlie, his brother, got killed, and he suffered a great deal from his wound. He lived a night and a day after he was wounded. We've seen hard times there, meaning Pennsylvania, but we got enough to eat there. But we don't now. As for myself, I get enough, for I don't want nothing to eat hardly, for I'm almost sick all the time and half crazy. I'm telling you, I saw this time and time again from Civil War soldiers. Using their wives as confessors, opening up, being emotional, being expressive. The idea that Civil War soldiers closed themselves off and always represented themselves to their loved ones as men of iron discipline who weren't affected by war is just simply not the case at all. I never wanted to come home so bad in my life, but it is so that I can't come at this time. But if we come down south, I will try to come anyhow, for I want to come home so bad. Rejiggering of sense of duty. End of August 1863, John Futch and 11 other men, all from this neck of the woods. They left their camp. They were well armed. They had extra ammunition in their pockets, trying to get their way back to this area. Intercepted in the James River, just south of Charlottesville. A gun battle erupted. The arresting party, all North Carolinians. The officer was shot. Richard Mallett shot in the chest, killed instantly. Futch and his comrades surrendered. I don't believe there was even a court-martial, executed in front of their entire division at the beginning of September of 1863. A man who couldn't be more different than John Futch is Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. There's his picture. As you know, Oliver Wendell Holmes from the Brahmin family of Boston. Oliver Wendell Holmes just had a giant intellect, thoughtful, reflective. And in 1864, he wrote another letter to his father. He liked to lecture his father, which is somewhat comforting when you have teenage daughters and you hear, my teenage daughters, of course, tell me all the kinds of things that I get wrong and don't do right. Well, Oliver Wendell Holmes did the same thing with his father. Again, this is fall '64. I started this thing as a boy. I'm now a man, and I have been coming to the conclusion for the last 6 months that my duty has changed. I can do a disagreeable thing, or face a great danger coolly enough when I know it is a duty, but a doubt demoralizes me as it does any nervous man. And now, honestly, I think the duty of fighting has ceased for me, ceased because I have laboriously and with much suffering of mind and body earned the right to decide for myself how I can best do my duty to myself, to the country, and if you choose, to God. So when we think about Civil War soldiers, and I've given you just a few examples, I hope we will remind ourselves that these men of duty, that these men of conviction, that certainly cannot be dismissed or diminished. But what we need to remind ourselves is that all these soldiers had multiple personalities. And during the course of the war, being a Civil War soldier was not just a single state of being, constantly evolving and constantly changing. Thank you. Yeah, oh, we got a question too? Oh, you need this. I know some of you need to, can't get this out. Hold on. There you go. I know some of you need to leave, so please, I know it gets late at night and driving can be hazardous at night. So yeah, please. Any questions, comments, concerns, and we can talk about anything, even stuff that's not about the talk. I'm happy to always talk about Gettysburg.
I'm going to start, this is one of the things when you run around with the mic, you get the honor of asking a question if you'd like. Is there any sense whether the correspondents, the soldiers from the South or the North, did a better job of explaining themselves or confessing themselves to their family? Any noticeable difference?
So my quick answer to that is this. They're both very revealing on both sides. Look at John Futch, a man who's illiterate, and he's willing to admit to a comrade that he's going half crazy. And knowing that that letter would probably be circulated amongst family members. So there's still an emotional openness that you see amongst these men. But there is one thing that is more dominant on the Southern side than the Northern side, and that is a code of honor that is absolutely obsessed with public perception. And that public perception is tied to reputation. Southerners are absolutely obsessed about that. And to preserve that, there are times that they weren't as self-critical or as open as I found among Northern soldiers. To give you an example, a Connecticut regiment, 14th Connecticut at Antietam, the regiment's first battle, many of the men found ways to escape fighting by helping a wounded comrade off the field. That happened a lot during the war. One of the members of that regiment was a correspondent to the local paper, and in the local paper, he didn't name names, but he called out the regiment for men not doing their duty. I've never seen anything even really remotely close to that, except when a Confederate officer in particular is trying to put the blame or responsibility on a failed attack on the shoulders of someone else. What should come to everyone's mind immediately is what? Pickett's and Pettigrew's charge, right? The Virginians had control of the press in Richmond. It's their accounts that surfaced to the top, and it's their accounts that blame the North Carolinians, in particular, Pettigrew's men, for the failed assault at Gettysburg. That's one of the few instances, but again, that's nothing that is admitting or acknowledging culpability, right? No, none of Pickett's men did that, but they pointed fingers. On the Union side, you see people acknowledging fault and failure within their own units.
Questions? Back here.
Was there any systemic censorship or related any retribution if soldiers' mail was read when they were being so candid?
So it's not, I think World War I, it begins when mail is read and censored before it's sent home. I don't think it happened in Spanish-American War. It did not happen in a systematic way in the American Civil War. However, I've seen many examples on the Confederate side. I've not found any on the Union side. John Futch wrote his wife just a week or two before he deserted. He wrote his wife and said, the officers are reading our letters. And he was preparing her to go because as a soldier's wife, she could get relief rations from the local community. And he said to her, go and get those rations. Obviously, he was plotting, knowing that as soon as he deserted, she obviously would not be able to get that. So I've seen it on the Confederate side, not systematic. An Alabama officer, Joshua Calloway, served in the Army of Tennessee. He wrote his wife and he said, the letters you send to me are so uplifting and reaffirming and keep me fighting. He said, I've read the letters of the wives of my men. And he said, they are all begging, pleading for them to desert. That same with John Futch. After this execution, the Richmond papers, the Richmond papers are really the papers of the Confederacy. Their articles, they get sent and published throughout the South. And in those articles from Richmond writers after the execution, they blamed all of this on Southern women. It is the women who continue to write these letters, and they write these letters of desperation. That's why the men are leaving. And there was, in fact, a law that was passed in the fall of '63. I'd love to know if anyone was ever prosecuted for it, that you could be prosecuted for sending a letter encouraging a Confederate to desert. I don't think anyone was ever prosecuted under it, especially no woman was. I mean, there's again why women could be political in ways that men could not, right? If a man were to write that kind of treasonous letter, he'd have to answer for it. But a woman could say, we're the fair sex. We're not political. We're women, right? We can't be political. They were deeply political, right? And a critical part of this. That's all. You got the hand there? Yeah.
Here you go.
To that question, a lot of the women wrote letters of the hardships that they endured at the farm and doing the work. And so don't you think that a lot of that played on the men's mind as far as, them being able to subsist and do that?
Absolutely. Listen, the war is almost like all wars. So though again, and I don't want to just say it. Today, the federal government and the military provide support systems for spouses, men or women, husbands or wives, that is extensive and covers a range of services. Now, you might disagree about the level of support. Maybe you think it needs to be more or less, but the hard fact of it is institutionally where we are today, there's nothing that even comes remotely close to that in the Civil War. Consequence, if you're poor, Northern or Southern, and your husband or your son has departed to go into the ranks, that loss of manpower is a massive blow. On the Confederate side, Futches didn't own any slaves, right? They didn't own any slaves. So we see again why the call for Southern women to be patriotic, to write support, even affirming letters. You could live that out as a Southern woman if you were of the upper class and you had slaves. It was much easier. Now, over time, that even became a challenge. But certainly the burdens that were placed upon these families, which weighed upon these men continuously. I'm a Michigan soldier of the Iron Brigade. I've been working on him for a while. He's in the book, but I went back to his letters. And there's a point in which his wife wrote him and said that she had to go and get a job, that she could no longer support their child, and she couldn't find a decent place to live. And he wrote her back and said, if you do this, I'm deserting, and this violation of honor will be on you. Don't do it. So again, that sense of reputation of being a man and being able to take care of your household. So that weighed upon them, and in a caring and loving way. This soldier, John Partington from Michigan, I'm struck by how his military service intensified his love for his wife, and it flowed into his love for nation. It was all connected. So there's James McPherson, there's the idealism or ideology. That's all important. It's all so critical. But also his views fluctuated from time to time, depending on what time of the war we're talking about. And then at the very end, I should say, after Chancellorsville, John Partington wrote his wife and said, get the house. We've saved some money. Your father has that money. Take that money. We'll get the house. You'll have a place to stay. We'll be happy there after this war. July 1st, it's the Iron Brigade. You all know where they fought. McPherson's Woods. You all know who they fought against. Pettigrew's North Carolinians at 26 North Carolina. John Partington's killed somewhere in McPherson's Woods. Someone came to identify the bodies a few days after the battle. For the battle, the bodies had been so, in a sense, disfigured, charred from the sun, bloated. They were unrecognizable. Sarah reads the papers that her husband John's missing in action. Of course, hoping against hope that he's captured, which they were able to determine that he was not. Body again, never ever recovered. And here again is this poor woman. Everything that John feared, he wrote that to her. He said, I'm afraid to do this because life is so tenuous here. If it's not sickness, it could be the battlefield. And then what will happen to you? See the profound difference between today and the support we provide veterans and their families from then. It's a profound difference. It's a great book. It's a weird title. Shook Over Hell. It looks at the issue of trauma and PTSD, compares Vietnam soldiers to Civil War soldiers. It's a brilliant book. And the basis of the book were mental health records from an Indiana asylum that this author, Eric Dean Jr., discovered. It's tragic, man. It's terrible. This woman, these are people, family members who have to admit their loved ones because they can't function anymore. And this poor woman is admitting her father, who had survived Andersonville. And she wrote on the application that her father, whenever he'd meet anybody for the first time, he would just start talking about Andersonville. That's all he could talk about. So obsessive about it. And then he encouraged that person to go to the backyard, because in the backyard, he had built a model of Andersonville prison, and he would give them tours. That's rough stuff. But it's a good book to read because their idea of trauma and PTSD is very different. Their idea about killing is very different from us today. Very different. It's a book, Shook Over Hell. Shook Over Hell. You can still get it. It's on Amazon. It's paperback. It's not cheap, but it's a good book. Good book.
Yes, sir, I'm coming. By the way, just so we have a reference point, how many people in here served in Vietnam? Thank you for your service.
Yeah.
So these people were very prolific writers. There's letters from all over, you always find them everywhere. How timely were the letters? If I wrote a letter today, when would it get to my wife in the north or in the south?
Obviously, it depends on how far away you are from the Army, but a letter from Virginia would reach Indiana in somewhere between 7 to 10 days. A lot of stuff got lost. So it was more reliable than what you would imagine, but I want you also to put yourself in the position of a poor soldier who's got his pay, and pay was always unreliable. They would sometimes, most always, the government/Army would be 3 to 4 months behind in paying these men. 3 to 4 months. They are impoverished on both sides. They are absolutely impoverished. And then you get your money and you want to give some of that back home. And there's this one soldier named Charles Bowen from New York, and he would divvy up his money in 3 different envelopes. Of course, to increase his odds, right, that at least some of it would get back to his wife. They did have what we would call a cashier's check, and they would use that as well. But it was, correspondence was more reliable than what you would imagine, but it still was very unpredictable. And again, that connection with those at home. Look, I often looked at those practical conversations between soldier and wife and thought, that's very interesting. And again, I then recognized the great love that that husband and wife are showing for each other. At the time that that woman took, invested in making and packaging those things, and what that did for not just the man's spirits, but for his chances of survival is huge. And so I can't say enough that I hope when you go back to a battlefield, that you think about what these men were thinking about. And here's the other thing to consider. We've all seen those gruesome photographs of Antietam and of Gettysburg. And we think that that's a transparent window into the past, and to some degree it is. But what I want you to always think about, that at a place like Antietam, 20,000 plus casualties in a single day, the sum of that number, it's so massive, right? It's so overwhelming. And that number is hard to penetrate. And what I'm asking you to do, and what I tried to do in my book, is we have to extract from that number, these are real people. And you think about the Hagerstown Turnpike and all those bodies, those corpses, they're all gnarled together, right? They're bloated and frozen to death. It's horrible. But to remember that, there's a blacksmith there who's got his brains oozing out of his head. There's a farmer there that's left 3 children back at home he'll never, ever see. There's a clerk who's killed here. There's real people here. And we lose that through the numbers. And we lose that when we go to battlefields and we ask ourselves, what's the bloodiest place? Where's the real killing ground? I'm tempted by that question as well. But for those of you who have served in the military, you all, I'm sure, recoil from such a question. Because what it does is makes violence like a form, I'm serious. It makes violence like a form of pornography. I want to see where all the killing occurred. No, wait, let's think about what that really meant. Let's think about what that loss was. Let's think about the words we use on the battlefield. They pushed back the Confederates. Why did they push them back? Because they killed them. When we say, hey, this was a great regiment, we say that about the Iron Brigade. Why do we say it's a great regiment? Because they were good at killing, were they not? Let's call it what it is. I say all of that out of respect to the men and their wives who endured that. And I don't say that in sort of wagging my finger, lecturing kind of way, because I struggle with that very same kind of language. These battlefields are commemorative landscapes. They are beautiful places. They are deceptive places. We go there and we get lost in the heroism of war. Every time I take a group to Pickett's Charge, I turn them around and I say, look in Spangler's Woods. Describe for me what you'd see behind the lines. You'd see men that might be called cowards. You'd see walking wounded. You'd see enslaved people. You'd see a different side of the battle. Because in most cases, our line of sight is oriented around lines of advance, which again is understandable, but there's a holistic picture here. Holistic picture to get all those dimensions. And that's what I tried to do in the book. What I'm trying to tell you all now. The goal is to try to stand in the shoes of those men, knowing that we can never fully do it. Again, those veterans out here, you all know it. And my father served in Korea. He was 18, Southern Indiana, got drafted. He's just a kid, man. My aunts, uncles told me he came back a different man, and I heard it. He'd scream out in the middle of the night. He told me his happiest day of his life was not marrying my mom, or my birth. He said the happiest day in his life is when his leg was broken and he flew back to Tokyo, I think. In fact, my point is that, the men and women that have to wrestle with these things, it's so incredibly complex. We have this great obligation, not just to the people who had served in Vietnam and today, but to the people in the past. All right? And it's a journey we're all a part of. And guess what? We'll never find it. We'll never get to the Holy Grail. And that's the beauty of it. It's the beauty of it. I spent all day last Saturday. I had John, obviously my wife wasn't home and my kids were gone. I spent my whole day reading John Partington's letters to his wife, Sarah. I was absolutely immersed. What did I do on Sunday? I went to the heart of McPherson's Woods and went in the soul of my own, right? And just thought about John, thought about that house that he wanted with his wife, thought about how much he loved his child, thought about the fact that he admitted to his wife that before the war that he had been abusive, and he wished that all those nights that he could take away. And he said he couldn't wait to get back home to prove to her that he'd become a different man. That's just true. And yet there's something beautiful in it, because he said that every time he looked at the flag of the 24th Michigan, he thought of her, he thought of his baby, and he thought of his home. And he said, this is a war for liberty. This is a war for our nation, and it is worth fighting and dying for. It's torturous and it's beautiful all at the same time.
I think with that, we'll have Peter come down and sign some books, and let's give him another round of applause for our great lecture.